Well, in our last class, we were talking about Gordon Allport. And you may remember my mentioning that Gordon Allport is credited with, teaching the very first theories of personality course that we know of being offered in this country. And you may also recall that Allport was influenced by a man named Edward Spranger, who had these 6 types. And Allport was interested in being able to develop, these various, that is being able to identify various types of personality. And so, he began looking for ways in which you could distinguish one person from another, and in some respects, so that you could identify. That is, your observations would be such that you could tell from some things you observed about one person that they fell into a type different from another person. Now, Allport also, of course, became interested in a distinction between character and personality. And if you recall, what the distinction that Allport made that he thought was important is once you begin attributing values to a person, you are into the world of character. That is, personality is more descriptive. It tells us about people. But once you start saying, like, this is a good personality, he would say, no, this is a good character. Because attributes like good and bad, or beautiful and ugly, and kind of contrasting things, really have to do with character. And that personality is something that we try to describe without giving it values like that. Now, Allport, like really everybody we're going to study, struggled with defining personality. And this is a theme that's come up in our class a number of times. I mean, here we are, we're studying personality, but actually it is very difficult to define. And with each theorist, we actually spend a lot of our time trying to focus on what is the definition of personality. And you can see over time, and Allport certainly is a good example, that people change their definitions. Now, on top of that, Allport had the added problem that philosophically, he believed that people are unitary, and that people are complex, and they evolve over time. So that in many ways, our personality is constantly changing. He would see it in a very positive way. Our personality is constantly developing. It's constantly growing. And it's very difficult then to have a definition when actually the phenomena you are going to study is not constant. And in addition to that, since he saw personality as really a combination of factors interacting with each other, and it was all of those factors interacting that created your personality, it made it more difficult for him then to figure out how are you going to define these factors, since he didn't want to take the position that these factors, or any given factor, really determine personality. But there really isn't another way that he had found, or have others found, to study personality except to break it down into to subcomponents. So identifying subcomponents is going to be something that we will talk about today. And actually, we've done that with basically every theorist. But what makes it more difficult for some theorists like Allport is when they want you to appreciate that it's kind of the whole person you should be looking at. But we don't know a way of looking perhaps at the whole person, except when we begin to do things like, identify character types. But even when you identify character types, one of the first things that happens is you begin to break them down into subcomponents. And another interesting thing that Allport emphasized too, if you remember, I was saying that, he got his PhD in psychology at a time where psychology is very experimental and where studying things like perception was important. And while he wanted to move away from that, he really did make the point, and it's key, is that the way you perceive determines the way your personality may develop. In fact, the way your personality will develop. So he was saying, two people could experience the same thing, but it could be quite a different experience for each person depending on how they perceived it. So that somebody might perceive a look from another person as an inviting look, as a welcoming look, as one that said something like, I like you, perhaps we could be friends. Someone else could be looking at that same person, view that same look, and come up with the conclusion, boy, that person's cold. That person doesn't like me. That person wouldn't at all want me to approach them. The same look, it's the same person. But depending on what's going on inside someone, Allport is saying the way that you might perceive reality can differ greatly. And it is the way that you perceive things that will lead you to act in one way or another. Then he also, posited, as I said, he needed to come up with some subcomponents. And he becomes, one of the early trait theorists. And you will recall, we talked about traits yesterday and a number of things about traits. We talked about cardinal traits, which tend to be the kind of dominating traits that identify a person. Example we used is, like a person who is really power-driven. I mean, they got to exercise power and control in everything. Well, that becomes a cardinal trait. Then we talked about central traits. And you will recall those are the kinds of things that are descriptive of a person. The person is thoughtful, person is kind, person is outgoing, that those kinds of characteristics, which they're important characteristics, that they're not dominating the personality, but they sure tell us a lot, about someone. And then, he talked about secondary traits. And the nature of secondary traits, is that they're passing, they don't last a long time, they tell us a little bit about a person, but not a lot. I mean, for example, if you were to, say someone likes a certain kind of food, well, you might generalize somewhat that, people who like ice cream maybe are a certain kind of person. It's a pretty big leap. What you really know is that this person really likes ice cream. You don't want to generalize too far from that about their personality, but it is a characteristic of them because they so often perhaps, indicate, I love ice cream. So, but secondary characteristics he felt that are unimportant. He didn't want to spend a lot of time on them. Now, this brings us then to the next step in studying Gordon Allport. And the next thing we're going to talk about is what he meant by self. And if we can bring up our first PowerPoint of the day, the first thing that you're going to see here is that Allport thought self was important, and he maintained that this concept was important for two reasons. First, the one certain criteria he thought that we have of our identity and existence in the world is our own self. And secondly, he noted that contemporary theories of learning, motivation, and development really need some concept of self in order to account for the differences in behavior that are produced by differences in individual experiences. That is, it's important to understand that the same experiences can have relatively different meaning to different people. And he said it's the self that's the organizing principle that determines how you experience life. Now, you'll note that what Allport does is he substitutes a term. I love personality theorists like this. You know, they can never go with the language that we tend to understand, so they come up with new terms. He comes up with proprium, a word you use every day. And proprium means self. Even he says it means self. But when you read, you will see he talks about the proprium, your proprium. So you want to realize that when we're talking about proprium, we're talking about self. And his definition included things like it meant what is peculiarly ours. And it included all aspects of personality that make for inward unity. And in his view, the proprium, or the self, develops continuously from birth to death. And it moves through a series of stages. And in some of his writings, Allport, somewhat contradicts himself in that he tries to avoid arguing for stages, but it's unavoidable when you look at his theory. But he really didn't want to have a stage theory, but he didn't find any way to get around it. So he came up with 7 stages for the developing self. Now, our first stage in developing the proprium, he called early infancy. Obviously, this is the first stage, and interestingly, in this stage, it involves no sense of self, because he did note, as so many psychologists have, infants do not separate themselves from their environment at birth. So infants start life being unable to distinguish between themselves and other objects. So this first stage, in many respects, is the same stage that Freud talked about and other psychoanalytic people talked about. Almost everybody talks about if you're going to have a stage theory, it's going to begin with birth. Now the next stage is called bodily self. And it starts for him during the second half of the first year of life. And it's here that children become aware of various parts of their body. And sometimes it's an unpleasant, learning for them. I mean, they learn they can hurt their hand by banging it on the wall. They also learn that they get hungry if they don't get fed at certain times. So, and the important thing that he observed is children are now beginning to make these differentiations. And it's the first time he's positing that children actually make differentiations. Now, his breaking things up like this is a little different, say, than Freud. He's got 2 stages already. For Freud, all of this would occur in what we call the oral stage. And he would put these behaviors in that stage. For Allport, there are 2 stages. Then there is a concept he identified as self-identity. And it develops during the first 18 months of life. And it causes, according to him, the young child to begin to recognize their uniqueness. And Allport used memory as a mechanism to establish self-identity. And what he said is he noted that we recall events that are particular to us. And he said this was really important to be able to distinguish ourselves from other people. This is how we begin to develop a self-identity. And as you can tell, in the beginning, this is a very vague concept. Now next what happens is self-esteem develops. And he says that in the third stage of the proprium, self-esteem emerges. And what this is a pride in one's pursuits and accomplishments. When I take this meaning, you know, the child is very early in life. So these are very basic kinds of things the child is doing. But the child can still take a lot of pride in what he or she is doing, especially if adults around the child are rewarding the child all the time for everything he or she does. And this is really how self-esteem starts. And Allport saw this actually as a very important stage. He noted that during it, children tend to reject everything parents suggest so that they can establish their own sense of uniqueness. And he said, while this period actually may be quite frustrating to parents, it is an important time of growth for children, as children are finding a way to express their individuality. And so in the beginning, often children are expressing their individuality by rejecting what it is the parents want them to do. What's kind of fascinating about this stage, of course, is we're talking about the child developing self-esteem. Now, those of you out there who have had children, and especially if you have children at this age, you realize while the child is supposedly developing self-esteem, the parent is losing self-esteem because the child keeps rejecting everything that the parent proposes. And it becomes, you know, a hard thing sometimes for the parent to see that it's growthful, that the child always seems to be negative during this time. Now, the next stage we call extension of self. It goes from approximately age 4 to age 6. And here, children are concerned primarily with possessions. That is, they see possessions as part of themselves. Pardon? Oh, you need the slide, okay. Everything in this stage becomes like my dog, my house, my sister. These statements refer to, you know, a genuine sense in the child that the child is beginning to feel an ownership and beginning to understand kind of the nature in a very primitive way of having things belong to him or her. Also, at this same time, the extension of self occurs. And this is when you have an expanding of personality, in that the individual is moving outside of his or her body and making contact with important objects in the environment. And as you can tell, since the child is talking about these belong to me, the child is valuing things at this point, and the child is considering possessions. Now this leads to the next stage, which we call self-image. Now, along with self-extension, children begin to develop what Allport called a self-image. And he said the self-image has two components. First, there are learned expectations of the roles we are required to enact, meaning that the child begins to learn there are certain things that he or she is supposed to do, and they realize that they're supposed to do that because the parents have that expectation. They also learn there are aspirations for the future. And it's primitive at the time, but Allport thought this was very important because this is going to be with us throughout our life. And he said, now children learn to do things that others expect of them, as well as to avoid behaviors that will bring disapprovals. So there really are two kinds of learnings. Things I should do because I get rewarded, things I should not do because I will be punished. And so the children begin to formulate plans, and these plans will involve the future. And they make tentative decisions about what they think they should do. And he said this is the beginning of developing values. Yes? We're still at about 4 to 6. Yeah. And importantly, in all of these stages, you know, for some children, this might start a little earlier. For some, it might start a little later. But basically, we're talking about ages 4 to 6. Now, and you notice a lot, he's positing a lot happens by the time the child is 6. I mean, the child already has some sense of planning for the future. The child has some, you know, sense of what's really expected, and some sense about, you know, what you should avoid. And also the child has kind of an understanding of reward and punishment. Now, by the time the child is in the age 6, and this next period, by the way, he says really runs from about age 6 to age 12. And children begin to engage in reflective thought during this time. And by the way, you know, it's interesting that, you know, depending on various people you talk to, when children actually begin to be reflective, that is, that they begin to make judgments, differs in all kinds of ways. You know, there are certainly theologians, for example, who, you know, posit that there's a certain age, and some will choose 6, some will choose 7, some will choose 8, or even later, where a child is capable of making a moral decision. That is, the child actually can understand that something is wrong, reflect on the fact that this is wrong, and make a decision about whether he or she is going to do it. Also, for those of you who are interested in the law has a lot of difficulty with this period. That is, the law has a lot of difficulty trying to figure out, you know, when are you really responsible? But from 6 to 12, you know, pretty much the law doesn't make you very responsible. The law tends to designate more, in some cases like 13 is the magical time. Depends on what state you're in. You know, you might be in a state where 12 is the magical time. But at some point, you become responsible for yourself. Now, what Allport is saying is it's during this period, from about 6 to 12, that children devise strategies to cope with problems. And he felt that they actually delight in testing their skills, and especially intellectual ones, because they're just discovering they have intellectual skills. And he also said, even at this time, though, you certainly want to be aware that the children are capable of distortion, and they're capable of defense. And he said this is the stage where children begin to sense their rational powers. And the earliest thing that happens when you experience your rational powers is you enjoy them. This is a pleasant discovery. And so Allport called this aspect of the proprium self as rational coper. And this is a term that will come up in other parts of his theory. Now then, he said, from age 12 on, people begin to develop the facet of their personality that he called appropriate striving. And he distinguished between two kinds of motives: peripheral and appropriate. Peripheral motives are impulses and drives, the striving toward the immediate gratification of needs, and the reduction of of tension. So these are very immediate things. We're hungry, so we eat. We're thirsty, so we drink. We're talking here about pretty simple and automatic acts, and most often the act is aimed at reducing tension. So those are peripheral motives. Then he said, there are appropriate motives that contrast with these. And appropriate motives involve the deliberate increase or maintenance of tension. and in the service of actually seeking some goal. So we try to attain a college degree, in spite of the fact that we may have to make many sacrifices. We try to become the best athlete we can in a given sport, meaning that we have to go through enormous practices. We have to give up a lot of ourself. Or maybe we want to write a great book, or we want to paint a picture, and we struggle with doing it. But what he's saying here is, all goals do not have to be focused on that you're trying to reduce tension. That actually, the more mature person accepts a lot of tension in his or her life in order to achieve these higher ends. And he would say that appropriate striving is really ego involved. And it's really ego behavior we're talking about. And he said this is characterized by the unification of personality. And this is the time when someone begins to pursue major life goals. Actually, in Allport, this whole concept is really kind of the highest form of selfhood. That is, appropriate striving is really you trying to become the best you that you can become. And he actually made this comment. He said, the possession of long-range goals, regarded as central to one's personal existence, distinguishes the human being from the animal, the adult from the child, and in many cases, the healthy from the sick. So, appropriate striving for him, being able to look to the future, being able to bind some of the tension that you have, being able to tolerate the tension that you have, being able to recognize it's worth having this tension in order to get to a worthwhile goal, all fell under this idea of appropriate striving. Now, he also closely linked the emergence of appropriate striving with the development of conscience. And he made the distinction, that in the child, the evolving conscience is a must conscience, or what Fromm might have called an authoritarian conscience. It's a conscience that's clearly based on fear of punishment. And children begin to internalize their parents' values and standards at this time, and they feel guilty if they violate the rules. They also know they might get punished. However, as people mature, there is a marked change, according to Allport, in their perception of the world and other people. And they begin to develop what he called an ought conscience, or what Erich Fromm might have referred to this as a humanistic conscience. And at this stage, obedience to the external standards of authority give way to an internal and self-generated set of values. And from then on, in the mature person, conduct is really guided by a person's own values or a person's own self-image. And the person is now doing things because they have reflected on what they think is good or bad. They have reflected on how they want to live their life, and they are motivated by internal values, which he saw as a very necessary jump from being motivated by what you had been told by the family is the way you should behave. So he's saying there is a shift then from must, where you feel compelled to do things, to an ought. And the ought is internally determined. It's what you honestly think you should do to be a good person. And he had noted, of course, as every psychologist does, that many chronological adults are still very much driven by their must conscience. That, parental prohibitions, lead to much unresolved guilt in people. And This was a very important point with Allport. I mean, and if you remember, Allport is a person who really had a lot of social concern. And he did feel it was very important that people mature and grow enough so that they can look around at society and really make decisions about how they can be that best person in society. Now, Allport also felt that the 7 aspects of the proprium emerged at different stages in life, but they did not function separately. In fact, he thought several of these can function simultaneously. And he gave this example. He says, suppose you are facing a difficult and critical examination. He says, no doubt you are aware of the butterflies in your stomach. And he would say, now that's your bodily self. Also, you're aware of the significance of the exam in terms of your past and your future. Big exam. He said, this is an issue of self-identity. It's going to affect how you're going to move in the future. He says, you're aware of your prideful involvement in the exam. You want to pass. He said, this is part of your self-esteem. You need this for yourself. You're aware of what success or failure may mean to your family or to other loved ones. And he said, now this is an example of self-extension. You're aware of your hopes and aspirations. This, he said, would be part of your self-image. And then he says, you're aware of your role as the solver of problems on the examination. And of course, that's you as a rational agent. And then you're aware of the relevance of the whole situation to your long-range goals. And that, he said, would be appropriate striving. So in actual life then, a fusion of the appropriate states is really the rule. That is, you have this very rich interaction often going on around issues in your life that are really important to you. Now finally, it's important to note that Allport developed certain characteristics that he described as reflecting maturity. And for Allport, maturity essentially referred to the ability of an individual to be independent. That these were almost synonymous for him. If you are a mature adult, you are independent. And then he used 6 criteria to examine whether a person had achieved this state. So his 6 characteristics of maturity, first of all, involve an extension of the sense of self. And here Allport meant that while self-love is important, the truly mature person can go beyond himself or herself and be involved with other people and actually have an internalized desire to influence the world around himself or herself. So the extension of self, you start, of course, by, it's necessary that you love yourself, that you respect yourself, that you have self-esteem. But if you're going to be mature, you have to take this further and begin to express these feelings to other people. Then he said, the mature person has a warm relatedness to others. And he made this distinction that the mature person not only relates to others, which is in our first variable, but actually they do so warmly. And even within this warmth, he made distinctions. He noted that an individual must be able to be intimate if they are going to be mature. That is, they really have to have a capacity to love other people. Secondly, he noted that mature individuals have compassion, which allows them both to identify with other people and simultaneously to recognize that others are different and that others can have different experiences. And they may be so different that they're not even familiar to you. But the really adult person, the mature person, actually has the capacity to recognize, you know, somebody else is having an experience I've never had. I mean, I'm not really sure what it is he or she is telling me happened, but I'm open enough to be able to recognize that what is going on inside someone else is unfamiliar to me, and I don't have to put it into some category that I am familiar with. In other words, I don't have to make that other person like me. Instead, I am at a point where I have a sense of wonder that allows me to recognize, isn't this marvelous? Actually, this other person is having an experience that I don't have the vaguest idea of what that's about. And if you recall when we talked about Maslow, you know, Maslow talked about this. You know, Maslow was saying if you have to keep on breaking everything down so that it's within your own realm of experience, you will miss a lot in life. I likened it, you know, to having your peripheral vision grow. That if you really are open to life, you will have these kinds of experiences where suddenly you realize someone is telling you about something, and this really is new. I mean, he or she has experienced something I have not experienced. And maybe even they're able to talk in a way and to tell you in a way about something that is really different than what's happened to you before. Now, one sign then that you've reached kind of the level of maturity that Allport is talking about is when someone tells you about something that you recognize as unfamiliar and new and interesting. If internally you get excited, internally you feel, this is terrific. I mean, this is really different. This is fascinating. On the other hand, if instead what you begin to do is to feel anxious, to tighten up inside, to kind of get scared that, this person has had experiences I have not had. This person is telling me about something that I'm really unfamiliar with. If that happens, then you haven't yet reached this stage where you're open enough to allow these experiences to come in. Now, the next thing, he said, happens is you develop self-acceptance. And by this, Allport meant that individuals have a certain emotional security that allows them to recognize their place in society and not be unduly concerned by deviant paths that others may take. Deviant doesn't mean bad here, it means different. In other words, an individual can be accepting of his or her lifestyle and not need to pass judgment on others' lifestyles. Now, this is a high degree, actually, of development. You find there are whole categories of people who, cannot allow others to go down paths different than them. Probably where you see it, most often is in religious groups who posit our religion is the only religion and our way is the only way. And so if you're not doing it this way, then you're bad. Other people, in this category, what Allport would say is, who are mature, would say, and maybe in the same religious group, that they could say, this is the way we do it. More importantly, this is the way I do it. Other people do it differently. That's okay. I don't need to pass judgment on other people. There probably are lots of ways to do things. I personally believe that the way I'm doing it is the best way. So, in other words, that ability to tolerate that others may choose to go along paths that you do not go along is very important to this sense if you really have self-acceptance. And of course, what he's positing about this is that if you can't accept kind of a deviant way with other people, if you can't allow other people to do things that you're not doing, then probably you're having some difficulty with self-acceptance. That is, you're still struggling to really have a good sense of yourself. And so one of the ways that you might develop this sense of yourself, not a healthy way, is to demand everybody be like you. Then that would reassure you, I must be a good person because everybody is doing it the way I do it. Now, the next characteristic he talked about was having a realistic perception of reality. And this simply indicates that a person is able to experience reality as a phenomenon that's outside themselves and accepting it rather than distorting external reality because of perhaps internal chaos the person experiences. Thus he's saying, the more peaceful, mature person recognizes that life is complex and accepts it, even to the point that you may have developed some fairly important values. You meet someone, they begin to challenge some of your values. Now this is a person that you really like, maybe a person that you care about a great deal, maybe a person you're very intimate with. They begin to challenge some of the values, perhaps values you've held for a long time. What he is saying here is that if you're mature, you could tolerate that. You wouldn't necessarily change your values, but you might be open to reflecting on whether the other person is right. You wouldn't necessarily have to engage them in such a way as to prove they're wrong or to prove you're right. What you would be able to do is to recognize, no one has challenged this in me before. I have always thought that this is the way to do it, but maybe I should think a little more about what this person is proposing to me. I've never thought this way before. I really like this person. I really want us to do well together. Perhaps it is time for me to reflect. And of course, if the other person is equally mature, and let's say you come to the conclusion, no, the other person is wrong here, then when you point out to the other person the way they're doing it probably isn't as mature as it could be, that person begins to reflect and to say, well, I haven't thought about it your way. Now that I begin to think about it your way, maybe you're right. That's what this is all about. Now then, he said self-objectification occurs. With this concept, Allport said that mature people not only know themselves, but they have an insight into both their abilities, they know their strengths, and they have a real insight into their limitations. And he posited that the type of insight one has in such a situation includes a sense of humor. Might not be the variable you would think that he would bring up at this time. But Allport actually was very intrigued with humor. And he studied it quite independently of studying personality theory. And in fact, it was a phenomena that he thought was characteristic of all adults. And he always wondered about, what are the elements of humor? And he wrote a book on it, so that if you became interested in studying it, you can read his book. Now the sixth one, he called Unifying Philosophy of Life. And Allport indicated that mature individuals have some sense of a theory regarding the direction of their own life. This theory, it can be very idiosyncratic. It can be very personal. What is important about it is that this unifying philosophy is thoughtful, that it's consistent. He thought it needed to be teleological. That is, your philosophy of life needed to be focused on where are you going. And very importantly, he thought it has to give a certain peace to your life. That you need to have a unifying philosophy that helps you to think not only about the present, but to think about where you're going and to feel at peace, to feel calm about this philosophy. Now, much of what Allport said really represented a very new way of looking at personality. I mean, Allport was a person who was trying to break new paths. As I've mentioned, he was trying to get away from psychopathology and abnormal behavior, really look at what real people are like. And so he posited a lot of things that did not exist in previous theories. Well, in our next class, we're going to go on to look at some other aspects of Allport that are actually quite fascinating, but we'll stop for now.